The era of classics. Are they over? The Cat in the Hat, The Hungry Caterpillar, and the Dr. Seuss books. These are all books that I loved reading as a child, and I loved having these books read to me. Well, actually, that never actually happened because my parents didn't read books to me. But anyway, these are the books that many of us also want to one day read to our children too. Why is that? Well, I had to think about this, and I realized that there was one thing in common with all of these creations, and that's the fact that they were all created many, many decades ago. Take, for example, The Hungry Caterpillar, 1969. The Cat in the Hat, around the 1950s. And the story that everyone loves, Harry Potter. The book started coming out in the 1990s. So as you can see, many of our favorite classics today, or what we see as classics, were created many days ago. And it makes me ponder, are the era of classics actually over? Or is it just becoming harder and harder to recognize them, or even just create them in the society we live in today? That's the question I want to answer. To answer that question, I've brought with me an expert in classics, an academic researcher who has been studying this topic for many decades. Excuse me, ma'am. I was wondering if you could please share your view on classics. Okay, she's not feeling too talkative right now. However, I do want to continue with the video. So back to the topic, classics. What do I mean by classics? What is a classic? Well, to me, a classic is just a feeling. It can be quite subjective, but I think objectively there are many creations out there that we as a society would all agree that they are classics. For example, I'm talking about these children's books, or like Harry Potter, for example, or there are many other TV shows. I thought about it, and I realized that there were really three things that defined what means a classic to me. The first thing that I define as a classic is a creation where you just have this kind of reaction. When somebody tells you they haven't seen or read or listened to that very thing, your immediate reaction is, dude, what? How have you not seen that? Or how have you not read that? The second thing is that a classic it's the type of creation that just makes you feel a sense of warmth, a sense of nostalgia. It takes you back. It makes you feel good every time you watch it. And the third thing about a classic, or what makes a classic to me, is that a classic will always transfer across generations. It's the reason why The Cat in the Hat and books like The Hungry Caterpillar were really popular 30, 40, 50 years ago, and they continue to still be popular today, and they will probably still continue to be popular in the coming decades as well. Yeah. Classics are timeless. They never get old. The other thing about classics is that they span across various mediums. It's not just books, it's not just TV shows. I mean, with books, like I said, we've got Harry Potter for adults, we've even got Goosebumps for kids, we've got those classics like The Cat in the Hat that I mentioned. With movies, there's Home Alone, Titanic. You know, these are the kind of movies that just make you feel good every time you watch them. Maybe not the Titanic. There's board games, Monopoly, Uno. So it's not just things you consume, but also things that you play. There's famous TV shows like Friends, Seinfeld, The Office. There's just something special about all of these classics, regardless of the medium they're in. And I think it's the fact that they hit those 3 points that I was talking about. There's that aspect of, oh my God, I can't believe you haven't played or seen that thing. There's that aspect of warmth. And lastly, there's that intergenerational transfer where it's just timeless. Why is it that it's so easy to name classics from decades ago as opposed to classics from, say, the last decade or two? The reason for that is there's three particular things about the time period that existed decades ago that's fundamentally very different to life right now. The first thing is scarcity. Now, back in those days, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, there just wasn't as much content or media as there is today. You know, we live in the day and age of social media where there's a billion reels coming out every single day. We live in the day and age where on Netflix there's new hits all the time. But if you imagine decades ago, the amount of production, the amount of new movies, books was very minimal in comparison to today. And what that means is people had less to compare to. And because of that, having less options, they generally had a greater appreciation for what they had. The second thing is the perceived effort. Now, back then, creators didn't have the same tools and technology that they do today to create. Now, obviously today we have things like AI which completely replace or can replace the creativity that comes from humans, which is very unfortunate. But if you imagine the complete opposite ends of the spectrum, which was decades ago, creators did truly have to come up with their own ideas. So when we look at creations back then that we have an appreciation for today, one of the reasons we have such a big appreciation is we know that back in those times, the creations they made was a true showcase of their potential as human beings. It's a true showcase of what we as human beings can achieve. And so it's astonishing to us. It's why we have such a great appreciation and amazement for those creations of the past. You know, if you go to museums, if you go to art museums, for example, there's a reason why we're amazed at art we see from such long time periods ago, like the Mona Lisa, for example. If someone created a Mona Lisa today, do you think people would be amazed? Hell no. No one would care because it's so easy to create such a piece of artwork. It's so easy to lead onto technology to outsource that creativity. It's just seen as not as special. And so that brings me to the third point as to why decades ago it was easier for classics to be created. And the third thing is originality. Back in those days, it was very easy, relatively speaking, to come up with a new idea that had never been seen before. And that is simply because the quantity of content to compete against was so much less than it is today. However, with today's abundance and ease of creating, it's so much more difficult to create something that is genuinely new, a brand new idea. However, that doesn't mean it's not possible, and it has actually been done. But those are the three things that truly matter when it comes to classics. So I bring up the idea again. Why does it feel like we have much less classics when it comes to the modern day? Now, I offer two possible explanations. One is that there simply is just an overabundance or an oversaturation of creations available around us. You know, it's like the limitless supply of music on Spotify, the limitless supply of short form content on Instagram or TikTok, the limitless supply of movies and TV shows on Netflix, on Amazon Prime, Stan, Binge, Apple TV, you name it. So the oversaturation makes us appreciate less. And the other idea that I present is the fact that Maybe we just don't know a classic is a classic during the time period it's created, and it's only future generations or much later in time when it's recognized that, oh, that really was a classic. I mean, do you think Home Alone, when it first came out, people truly felt that it would become a classic decades later? Did people know? That's a question to answer. I would put forward this point of view. It's perhaps not the fact that we as a society have stopped creating incredible, ingenious ideas. It's perhaps the fact that we've just got so many options around us. We've become desensitized to genuinely great ideas when they do appear. Now, I mentioned earlier that I've got a clear case of what is a classic, to me at least. But objectively, I would say a lot of people would be in support to say a show like Stranger Things really is likely to become a classic decades from now. And that's the fact that it hits those three things I was talking about. I think it will become one of those shows where people will genuinely be surprised if you haven't seen it in the future. It hits the emotional side of you because the show just has such a great storyline. And lastly, I think it really is intergenerational. I mean, if you think about it, that show was set around the 80s or 90s. There's a reason why we still felt connected to it, and that's because we as humans fundamentally just really appreciate the fact that the show was able to show us much more simpler times. We feel connected to that. Now, here's a closing thought. Me personally, I don't want the era of classics to be over or to ever be over. I want the generations of the future to experience the same kind of joys that the generations of the past and the present have experienced. And that is that joy of discovery, that dopamine hit you get from reading a book, watching a film, listening to a song that you just feel like it really hits you differently and it's going to be something you hold on to for a long time. Now, I think part of the responsibility to ensure that future exists actually does fall on the consumer, not just the creators who constantly create new ideas that are incredible. Because, like I spoke about today, part of the reason we feel more desensitized to the creations of today is because there's just so many of them that we, by choice, are consuming. So perhaps the way we can ensure that our ability to appreciate remains preserved is by intentionally consuming less and thus consuming more intentionally.